Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Steele again. Today I want to look at structure, and I want to look at when structure is a problem. Now, if you're like me, when I was an undergraduate, I had no clue what sociologists meant when they said structure, but they used that word all the time. The structure was not appropriate. There was a structure in place in terms of the way things were distributed. There was a power structure. There were structures everywhere. And and yet I had a hard time figuring out what they were talking about. And of course I didn't ask, but that goes along without saying. What I'd like to try to do today, having figured out, I think, what structure is share with you the sort of realistic understanding of structure, and then try to follow through looking at when structure might be a problem when you're trying to apply sociology to solve a problem. Let's take a look at this. I mean, realistically understanding structure, you can look around you and let's say you're walking into a classroom in Europe or the United States. Very likely what you're going to find are desks, and they're facing the quote front of the room. This material culture artifact, these desks in this room, represent for us a social structure in part because the roles, the role of teacher and the role of student, those interdependent sets of expectations and obligations, are also set up in an organized way. We've got somebody who allegedly knows something, who stands at the front of the room, and somebody who needs to know something, who's looking at him from the back of the room. Okay, pretty simple stuff, but yet remember that there are norms that guide their action. In other words, there are roles, for what students are supposed to do, and roles, for what instructors are supposed to do. And within some reasonably narrow definitions of how this should happen, the conduct of interaction goes on in a classroom. Well, because the rules and roles are guided by norms, remember, another word, rules in society, it turns out that those relationships in a classroom and those interactions that follow are structured. You can lean on them. You can lean on the expectation and rules for teacher or student. And in some ways, you don't think much, because if you know what the rules are, then you know what to do. And that structure routinely, over and over and over in a patterned way, transmits information, sometimes more effectively than others, from one person to another. Okay, well, let's also think about it on a more macro level. Turns out that globally, and this is a generalization, but family sizes in the West and in the developing world also are slowly but surely shrinking in size. Well, it turns out that a two-person family versus a three-person family, just in terms of the possible relationships between two people and three people, well, chances are they're going to be structured differently. But it's more than just demographics. Clearly, there are expectations in a culture for how big a family should be, who should be in it, what they should be doing. In other words, rules and roles for behavior. I came to think finally, as I tried to reduce it down to its basic essence, that it turns out that at the very cornerstone of structure were norms. In other words, rules for behavior. These were socially constructed. In other words, people basically made them up and then they lived in them. And these structures exist in many places. Now, that's not to say that they don't change, but we can see them. And what they do pretty effectively is they tend to provide a patterned way, a way that we can lean on, if you will, like a structure of a table or a chair that we can sit on, that routinely provides a certain outcome that we might come to expect. Now, these are all time sensitive and they're culturally relative, and it's important to see. But if we internalize structure and we think about it, it gives us a patterned way to act with a reasonably certain, not completely certain, but a reasonably certain outcome. This almost guarantees that by using these patterns, society can maintain itself. Or at a micro level, that a relationship between two people can sustain itself. If you're in love with somebody and you have a relationship with them, it's a structured activity. You'll see in terms of time and space that there are rules for action. And just see what happens if he's supposed to show up on time and he doesn't. Yeah, I know. Violation of the rules show you where the structure is. Okay, well, that's just a basic thought. So let's go on from there. Once we've defined structure, okay, we can look at when structure is a problem. Now, I'm going to rely on functionalism, conflict, and interaction as a theory here, and you'll probably be able to pick them out as you go along. Let's think about it for a minute. When is that system of norms, that's pattern of normative action, that supports our action, when's that a problem? Well, from a functionalist view, it's a problem when there's a gap between what the system's supposed to do and what it really does. We find this a lot in American families. The nuclear American family, or even a single parent family, is stretched to the limit in terms of trying to provide what it's supposed to provide, and when I say supposed to, that's a culturally relative term, in our society. It's a fairly small system as things go, but it has a lot of expectations. And particularly if you have both parents or both people working and you have children in that system, the actual function of caring for kids and making it possible for them to economically survive becomes a real challenge. Maybe the structure, in a sense, is not necessarily up to the task. So perhaps that in itself may be problematic. Now, notice I'm not blaming the individuals, and of course you could do that, but most sociologists don't. They look to see whether the social system, in other words, that system of norms that provides this kind of patterned outcome, we want to see if that social system is able to provide and do what it's supposed to do. When it doesn't, then we got a gap, and maybe we've got a problem. You might see that around work. Someone's asking you to do more and more work for about the same pay. What you may find out is that the structure of the reward system and the structure of the time around which work is supposed to be done simply doesn't keep up with the amount of work you're supposed to do. It's not that you're a bad person, that you can't get the work done. It may very well be that the structure of the role and the expectations, well, they just simply don't match up. Another way to look at this is looking at it from a conflict view. And of course, there are many, many ways to do this as we go on. But one of these is to look at the distribution of resources. For example, sometimes people will talk about a power structure. Well, clearly, if people have more power, they frequently have more resources, or they have command or control over more resources. That kind of a system which argues that the distribution of resources and valued items is a function of the patterned way that we distribute things. In other words, the normative structure. In other words, the structure we support. We may find that but power in and of itself is in the structure. Examples of that are the American class structure. So when, if you pick the right parents in America, you may have access to more resources. Of course, I'm being facetious about picking your parents, but ascribed status has a lot to do with it in terms of where you enter the social system, where you enter the structure. Life expectancies and life choices may be a function of where you enter the system. Consequently, the structure of the system, not whether you're a good person or not, has a lot to do with your opportunities. And I guess if you're looking at it from a conflict view, the distribution of resources are distributed in a patterned way. Last, if you take an interactionist view, very often what ends up happening is that problems arise when outmoded or outdated definitions of systems are in place. We often see this with regard to the definition of work. In an industrial society, when we start thinking about the emergence of manual labor and assembly lines, where a group of people put together some object, a car or a television, on a long line, and when each one contributes something to it. I got to define that now. I'm starting to realize a lot of people don't know what that is. But in an industrial society, that structure, the organized way that work proceeds, and who does it and how they do it, was very much thought of in terms of an assembly line idea. As we move to a post-industrial society, when we define work, if we continue defining work as assembly line kinds of work or assembly line kinds of behavior, we're going to have some problems, because the modern context of work is one in which assembly lines are simply not the way we do things. And you only have to be looking at this computer to understand that. So let's go on with this. In terms of structure, there are other things you can do. You can, of course, create structure. You can make it up. And this is fascinating because this is the creative side of applying sociology. You may be asked by a client to give recommendations on how something should be organized. What norms need to be in place? What roles? How should the work be done in a patterned way? Not necessarily the personalities of the people involved, but rather what's the composition of the roles, the rules, the norms and values that need to be in place to get something done. And very often, and I would argue, that planning, strategic and tactical planning, that's often done by organizations and businesses, is really something that sociologists need to look at. Because really it's applied structure creation. In planning for the future, or planning a company, planning for your family, that's another thought. These plans are often broken into projects, programs, and plans. The projects are smaller sort of ways of doing things that are very often broken into objectives that have to be fulfilled. So it guides what behavior needs to happen and when it occurs. The programs are made up of projects, so they're a little bit bigger, but they're organized and they have expectations and roles and rules for how things should be done. And last but not least, the plan is the summary of those things and the direction that you're heading, which is usually characterized by a mission statement, which is a statement of purpose, and a vision, which is a way to look down the road, trying to understand where you want to be so that that particular organization, that particular structure, gets you where you want to go. Now, planning then is a modern day application of the concept of structure. And sociologists ought to be able to do that really well. So if you're thinking about applying sociology, it's a good thought. And then last but not least, how does change fit into all this? Well, very clearly. It turns out that organizations and structures, if you will, are not static. There are internal and external forces which drive the restructuring, the reorganization of rules, roles, and norms, so that those patterns can be more effective in producing the outcomes that we need to satisfy some needs in the society. Well, that's pretty much it for today. That's long-winded stuff, but I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.